Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stolyarov II, and I am the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization.
Let's quickly look at a global life expectancy graph from 10,000 BC to today. It's a little off, but you get the point, right? It's getting better all the time. I'm here with my favorite transhumanist, Gennady Stolyarov, who is the author of Death is Wrong, one of my favorite books at this point. Also a leader amongst men and transhumanists in general. Thank you for being here. I'm glad you made it.
Thank you very much, Andreas. It's a pleasure to speak with you again.
Yeah, I hope that people have taken the time to check out Death is Wrong since our last conversation, because it's something that a lot of people didn't have the opportunity for generations to even consider, right? I mean, except for maybe the most religious people that were creating the idea of life after death. This is maybe the first time in history that we're talking about this as a grand populace that are making our own decisions and thinking about, do we want to die? Do we want to get old? I think also about people like Larry Ellison and Lex Luthor. There was a really cool page I wanted to pull up. 1100 years ago, monks were looking for the elixir of the immortal life, and they mixed together charcoal and saltpeter with cream of tartar and sulfur. Instead of immortality, they discovered gunpowder. Life comes at you fast. So I wonder what you think about along the way that people are working towards this. Some people are afraid that we're going to lose our humanity. Some people are afraid that this might destroy us. But also, we have all this evidence around us of people that have been working on this for decades now. We're seeing results all of a sudden. There are people that are looking like they're kind of defying age, and 120 might become the new 60, right? Like, we're seeing that.
I think this could well be the case for at least some people in the older generations, people who are middle-aged, or even some people who would qualify as senior citizens today. We know aging does not occur at the same rate throughout the human species, that it is possible to modify one's rate of aging. Now, there is a caveat. Today's techniques can only take one so far. So it's possible to modulate the rate of aging for most people by about 5 to 15 years. Perhaps some biohackers who undertake quite extreme regimens might be able to do a little bit better than that and get a 20-year improvement in biological age. To get much more than that, we would need to have rejuvenation therapies that reverse aspects of damage that occur at the cellular and molecular level. And this is where an engineering-based approach, such as the SENS approach, which stands for Strategies for Engineered Negligible Senescence, articulated by Dr. Aubrey de Grey, would come in. The good news is Aubrey has quite a bit of optimism about the time frame over which these therapies might become available. The key is might, because we still need funding and we need public support for this kind of research. But with adequate funding, he thinks there is a 50% probability that they will become available 12 to 15 years from now. And that is good news for people who are middle-aged or even older today, because if they can keep themselves healthy for that period of time, then those therapies might arrive in time for them. A good way to conceive of this is through multiple bridges to longevity. And this was the approach that was discussed by the famous futurist Ray Kurzweil, who recently also came out with a new book called The Singularity is Nearer. But in a previous book co-authored with Dr. Terry Grossman, Ray Kurzweil wrote about 3 bridges. The first bridge is healthy living. And with healthy living, it's possible to somewhat moderate one's rate of aging. And yes, there is Ray Kurzweil. I also interviewed him at RadFest back in 2018.
Right.
So the second bridge is biotechnology. Through advancements in biotechnology, it may be possible to achieve more significant age reversal, not just slowing down the rate of aging, but actually rejuvenating oneself. And then if one benefits from the wave of advances brought about by biotechnology and lives long enough to see the next generation of advances in nanotechnology, at that point, we will get essentially the ability to repair the body indefinitely. Think of nanorobots circulating through the bloodstream, detecting any damage at the cellular level, repairing the cells that are damaged, and sending continuous data so that one can actually track one's vital signs in real time. We already have some of this through fitness trackers, for example, and the fitness trackers are becoming more advanced and more sophisticated, but this will be extremely granular data tracking cell by cell, and it will be aggregated using AI to give people insights about exactly what's happening with their health so that they can intervene and catch problems very quickly.
Before they happen, which is what we're seeing now a lot of the time. And it's crazy also, Larry Ellison, he's 80 years old. This is one of Steve Jobs' friends, which, you know, I find really interesting also the way that worked out, because look at 80. I mean, he's looking pretty good for 80. I'm just saying, if you look like that at 50, you're pretty happy. I know dudes who look like this at 45. So, you know, he does look like he's doubled it. He's doing a little bit better than some others are in this game. Bryan Johnson even is throwing out an accolade to him. So, I mean, it doesn't seem as irrational. It doesn't seem as imaginary. It doesn't seem as hypothetical. It seems like these are all examples, right?
Yes, and I will point out, Larry Ellison used to have an institute which did fund anti-aging research for a few decades. Unfortunately, he seems to have stopped doing that sometime in the early 2000s, even though he's sympathetic to fighting death, and he has expressed that he essentially never understood why people accepted death because it seems like the greatest possible loss. But I don't know what happened to lead him to stop funding that research. It seems he might have applied some insights to help himself, of course, not age as rapidly.
Gennady, I'm the conspiracy theorist here. Come on, that's my line. No, that's
well,
okay.
I don't think these insights are anything nefarious, though, anything that he has hidden
He doesn't
from the
necessarily have
public.
to share everything he's
Right.
doing for himself.
Right. I just think when people are in possession of these kinds of resources, and more importantly, highly in control of their time, as billionaires are, as Bryan Johnson is, of course, as Jeff Bezos is, they can pursue experimental regimens and they can get advice from medical doctors. They can have any assistance that they need to make sure their days are structured in ways that are conducive to healthy living. And most of the rest of us, right, most of the rest of us don't quite have that flexibility, and we have to figure out ways to still treat ourselves decently while attending to all of our other commitments. Jeff Bezos did recently contribute funding to a company called Altos Labs, and Altos Labs works on essentially turning back the cellular aging clock, so cellular reprogramming. In the late 2000s, a scientist named Shinya Yamanaka discovered these 4 Yamanaka factors, which could be used to essentially de-differentiate adult cells back into stem cells. However, these induced pluripotent stem cells, they are essentially equivalent to embryonic stem cells, and they can be used, for instance, to assist in wound healing, organ regeneration. They're great for that. But of course, we don't want to turn our entire bodies into induced pluripotent stem cells. We would want to turn the cells of our bodies into younger versions of themselves. But for instance, you wouldn't want the cells of an infant, you would want the cells of a 20-year-old, for example. So this partial reprogramming is harder to do than getting the induced pluripotent stem cells, and that is what Altos Labs is working on. Now, I will have a critique of Altos Labs, and that is, like many startups funded by billionaires, for whatever reason, it's a bit shy about its ambitions and a bit secretive. So it, for instance, says it's not a longevity company, it's not an anti-aging company, it's a partial reprogramming company. That was what one of its spokespersons said about a year ago. And it was kind of strange because partial reprogramming is an anti-aging approach. If it is made to work, it would improve human longevity. But they don't want to go out and say that. And it's similar to, say, Calico, which was co-founded by Larry Page and Sergey Brin. It is a subsidiary of Alphabet, and it is doing some fundamental research in the biology of aging. But for whatever reason, Calico chooses not to make a whole lot of public statements about its work. So it has published a couple of papers here or there, but not a whole lot is really known about the research that it undertakes. So when I go to conferences about age reversal, longevity, rejuvenation, radical life extension, whatever names you want to use for it, I don't see people from Calico and I don't see people from Altos Labs for whatever reason. And I do wish they would participate, because I would be fascinated to know a bit more about their research. But I think that speaks to the importance of having a unified movement, having the millionaires and billionaires join the rest of us activists and advocates and researchers, and helping out with the many projects that are underway, like Aubrey de Grey's LEVF, the Longevity Escape Philosophy Foundation, of which I am the treasurer, by the way. LEVF needs money for more robust mouse rejuvenation studies, since our first robust mouse rejuvenation study has shown significant improvement in terms of the lifespans of mice that receive combination treatments as compared to the control mice. And we need to fund more studies with more treatments and a better baseline. So give all of the mice rapamycin, give them exercise wheels, and then on top of that, apply experimental treatments to see what difference those treatments in particular could make on the lifespans of the mice. But more money is needed for that. And then Bill Andrews, a friend of mine who runs Sierra Sciences in Reno, he is working on telomere research and inducing the enzyme telomerase to, one, prevent telomeres from shortening with every replication, and two, to even enable them to be lengthened, which would once again help with rejuvenation at the cellular level. I know he's in need of investors. So if any millionaires or billionaires are watching this show, please contact Dr. Bill Andrews and see if you could work with him to enable him to make a breakthrough, because he has told me for a number of years now, if he had enough funding, he could possibly find ways to reliably induce telomerase in human cells within like a year and a half or 2 years of receiving that funding. So we are close if we put in the money, if the public supports this research enough, or enough billionaires support it, that we can actually make these breakthroughs that are on the horizon.
It's interesting thinking about Altos and Calico writing new DNA code, because that's, you might have a legal segue there to say it's different than anti-aging research. Maybe there's some benefit to that I don't yet understand. But also by studying aging and understanding the metabolism of cells and genetics, and they can maybe train cells to do things like younger cells without actually emulating the way your cells were when you were younger. There might be another way to do it that they come up with. That might be part of the plan.
It's possible. I think one of the implications of their secrecy is we can't quite discern what they're doing. So they could be doing what you mentioned, but
I
just wish they were a bit more
Well,
transparent.
this is why Bryan Johnson. This is why
Right.
Bryan. We should talk about the insular elite mortals and William Shatner. But first, let's look at a guy who gets a bad rap for telling everybody everything he does. Right? I mean, here's a guy who one time, come on, man, like it's like that Scottish joke where you have one sheep, but he's got one time he does his intergenerational blood transfusion, finds out it's not super useful for him to use his son's blood, but ends up still giving his blood to his father. Right? So he's actually also extending his father's life. But he's been doing all sorts of anti-aging regimen where he's disclosing what he's doing. He's fully open about it. It's exactly, and people are calling him, and I think people are afraid of him, right? Like I think it's almost like to the pitchfork and iPhone wielding proletariat, he is a vampire. Because there's nothing else to compare it to. It's so outside the realm of the working man's belief that he can not die if he chooses, what to choose. It seems bourgeoisie.
Well, I admire Bryan Johnson in a significant way because he is not afraid to outright say, don't die, that is his goal, to avoid death. And I had a nice brief exchange with him.
Minor flex. I was about to say, you've actually got a good interview with him right here.
Yes, indeed. It was a brief conversation at Longevity Summit Dublin in 2023, but I asked him a question and he had to pause to consider his response for a moment, because I asked him essentially, well, what can we do to get more people in his position to outright say, don't die, to outright express the position that they want to reverse aging and solve this problem of mortality that befalls all of us. And he did have to think about the answer a bit, but he said, perhaps the friction is what we need to succeed, that somehow the opposition from the establishment, if it's particularly strong or vocal, could galvanize us to actually make these breakthroughs and motivate others to participate in the movement. So that's an interesting perspective, but it seems he's willing to take on the controversy. And it's interesting. Sometimes he intentionally courts controversy. I've heard another friend of mine, Mark Hamalainen, who runs the Longevity Biotech Fellowship and is actually helping to train the next generation of anti-aging researchers. He mentioned to me that Bryan Johnson said something along the lines of, if 50% of people don't hate you, then you're not being controversial enough. You're not pushing the envelope sufficiently. And it's a bit of a different strategy than I pursue. I actually pursue a very nice strategy by comparison. I try to be friendly with as many people as possible, even if they disagree with me. But Bryan Johnson definitely does like to push the envelope and sometimes likes to play into the stereotypes that
there's
people
a difference between, you're from Belarus. You wouldn't want to be rude in Belarus. I feel like he's from Utah, and there's a thing called Mormon nice. I feel like that's also, he's coming out of that. And so you get a little reactionary. You get kind of interested in disturbing things. But also, we kind of mentioned this earlier, there's a fundamental spiritual almost level of humanity that seeks immortality, that seeks to defy aging. It's something so primordial. It's not actually alien to us at all. It's something that's part of every tradition. Everyone has some kind of thing where they come back slightly different or they stay the same.
Yes, absolutely. And if you think about the earliest known work of literature, it's the Epic of Gilgamesh. It is about the pursuit of immortality. So as early as humans were aware of mortality, aware of what happens to other people and what would well happen to them in the long term unless something were done about it, they were seeking for ways to either escape it or to make peace with it. And escaping it in pre-scientific times would necessitate a recourse to mythology or religion, to some idea of the persistence of the soul, of the persistence of the self in another realm, because it really is inconceivable to think about one's own self, one's I-ness, as I call it, not existing. Really, if you try to imagine it, you can't, because you can't imagine the complete absence of anything. It's not like a long sleep. It's not like just a stasis, because you're not even aware of anything. You're not even remembering what happened before. It's as if you never existed. And that I think, is such a frightening idea that humans throughout history have resorted to every possible means to try to figure out how that wouldn't happen or how to make it not happen. And as somebody who is an atheist and materialist, I would say, unfortunately, there is no evidence that the self persists beyond the existence of this body. I think the self is dependent on a very complex array of biological
I think even a
processes.
theist would. All right, so a theist would have a hard time unless you wrestled it out for a second, maybe. But if you think about what theists believe, it's usually that you become something different. You have a tabula rasa with reincarnation. The idea of I-ness and self is still different than a theist would say about a soul, right? Because a soul is separate from your memories. So you're talking about a very specific thing, and it's something that you're trying to perpetuate the memory. And what is life really but memory? So to perpetuate life is to perpetuate the ability to remember what happened and to execute decisions and choices on that. That's all DNA is doing. That's all your cellular level is doing. So I don't see that as something that's even a conflict with the soul or Geist or energy or anything else like that, because that's not something that offers you the perpetuation of the I-ness or memory. That's
Right,
something separate.
right. And I will note there are many theists who are transhumanists who do embrace the pursuit of radical life extension in this world. At Radfest back in 2018, I met an older Christian gentleman. He was Catholic, and he and I had a lengthy philosophical discussion over breakfast. And he said he was interested in anti aging, he was interested in the technologies being discussed, but he wouldn't want to live forever because he believes in God, he believes in heaven, and he eventually wants to go there. And I told him, well, do you want to live to be 200 years? If this technology allowed you to be 200 years old and continue doing good works in the name of God, would you take that? And he said that
So
yes, he
Faustian.
would. Yes. So essentially, I told him at that point, you and I are aligned because in order to achieve a lifespan of 200 years for you, the precise changes that I and other transhumanists advocate would need to happen. And then when you're 200 years old, we can talk again about whether you would like to live further and perhaps do more good works in the name of God. But I think as long as people support this movement in the right direction, in the direction of extending life, they are our allies. And if you think about a lot of religious teaching, it involves helping the sick, it involves healing those who have been injured. Even the stories about Jesus talk about how he cured the sick, how he made the blind see, how he made the lame walk. And that is a set of very transhumanist kinds of transformations. So,
100%.
yes, as I like to say, religions evolve too, and they evolve in response to changes in technology, changes to society. So the Christianity of today is not the same as early second century or third century Christianity was, for instance. And it's not going to be the same in the future either. And as these technologies advance, religions, in order to remain relevant, will have to contend with them and will have to adjust their theological interpretations accordingly. And there is a Christian Transhumanist Association, there's a Mormon Transhumanist Association, speaking of Mormonism, and it's one of the most numerous transhumanist organizations, actually. If you think about Mormon theology, it talks about
Works pretty well.
man becoming more God-like and people having their own planets.
I like it. I'm a fan.
Mm-hmm.
Let's think about William Shatner. He said, "How do you stay young? How do I look so young?" He said, "Like I drink the blood of young runaways." That was his quote. But I think he does something a bit more interesting. Looking at William Shatner.
Yeah, so I actually met William Shatner on a few occasions, but last time in February of this year at the Biohacker Expo in Miami. And he is 93. He was already 93 at the time. And he looked like he was in generally good health. Now, he did have an injury from a riding accident that happened when he was 91. And so he had a shoulder injury that he was trying to get treated with various experimental therapies. Like he had an
If you're riding a
individual.
horse at 91, though, I mean.
Yes, yes. He had an individual applying this red light therapy patch to him while he was talking to us, but it was a nice conversation. We sat around the table. There were about 10 of us in all, and I was actually able to share with him some of the developments in longevity research, including advancements along the lines of the SENS approach that Aubrey de Grey talked about. But he was really interested to get these treatments as soon as possible. So I saw a kind of look of disappointment on his face when I mentioned Aubrey's probabilistic time frame of 12 to 15 years from now, because I think it's obvious he wants it to happen sooner. I also did ask him about how he has been able to remain this healthy for so long. And he actually said he didn't really need to go see the doctor until he was in his late 80s. So I think some of this is genetic luck. I also think some of this is the avoidance of particularly destructive habits. So if you think about William Shatner, if you look at him, he seems like a person who has led a kind of moderate lifestyle, not exceptionally athletic.
He was an alcoholic for a while, but he quit that after his divorce in the 50s or something, right?
Yeah.
So in his 50 years age.
Right. He quit it early enough.
Yeah.
He quit it before it did critical damage.
Yeah.
And this is actually an insight that I was able to gather from my friend Victor Björk, who is a biogerontology consultant. He also was involved significantly in longevity activism for a long time, and he and I actually co-organized 2 virtual running races during the depths of the pandemic in 2020 and 2021. So he now lives in Malta and he consults for various businesses. He has gathered a lot of insights about supercentenarians, people who live past the age of 110, and what differentiates them from most people. And what is key is that these are people who didn't necessarily have extraordinary physical fitness. They didn't have superhuman attributes in anything, really. But all of their attributes were good enough that none of them suffered a critical failure until very late in their lives. So Victor pointed out...
Another nod to Mormonism, right? Bryan Johnson, he just posted, alcohol isn't a good friend. It's clingy, tells you lies, wrecks your sleep, impairs your judgment, weakens sexual functions, doesn't respect boundaries. Word of wisdom intensifies.
Absolutely. And, you know, the Mormons are correct about this. I'm pleased to say that I've been sober for the past 33 years, which means the last time I had a drink of alcohol was at the age of 4. And that's
wow. Jesus went that long and ended up getting crucified. You know, that's a long, it's pretty based.
Yes, yes. But that's actually one of the personal habits that I think have contributed the most to my health, just abstaining from alcohol, also abstaining from tobacco, abstaining from recreational drugs. Those decisions, which are not hard, by the way, because it's actually not hard to absolutely reject something. Moderation in anything is a lot harder.
It's a lot easier for me to do things than to not do things. So if I'm like, I think a lot of these billionaires that are regulating everything they do in their day, there's no time for recreational drugs. You know, they have to be taking the supplements that they're supposed to be taking. They have to be eating the food they're supposed to be eating. They have to be exercising when they're supposed to be exercising, sleeping when you have to. You run out of time to waste if you try to take care of your time.
Right. Well, people who have a sense of purpose, people who are focused on whatever it is they want to achieve, they will take steps to achieve it. And they will think about, well, what helps that purpose and what hurts that purpose. And certainly having a sense of purpose, particularly later in life, can help to prolong life. A lot of economists, architects, painters, composers, those who lived into middle age and later, they tended to remain very productive well past most people's retirement ages. Like Frank Lloyd Wright went into his studio and was designing buildings essentially until the day he died. There's a painter named Alpheus Philemon Cole who lived from 1876 to 1988. And I've just started essentially resurrecting interest in his paintings through my virtual travel series on Facebook. But he's the oldest known painter. He lived until the age of 112, and he continued painting essentially until the end of his life. So these people tend to have more of a sense of purpose. They tend to have more of an understanding of what their lives are about. But what's absolutely crucial is they don't let their weakest link fail. So what could a failure look like? It could look like a heart attack or cardiac arrest or stroke or cancer, for instance, terminal cancer, though some cancer survivors have gone on to live a long time if they got rid of their cancers. So a good example is actually my grandfather. He had a form of skin cancer in his 60s, and he's 90, getting close to 91 right now. And because that cancer was completely removed, he was able to survive for a long time after that. So it's a question of, does one let any system, any part of the body get so bad, so damaged that it can fail critically and kill one? If not, then right now what happens is aging still occurs at the cellular level. So people do become frailer. Actually, another friend of mine, Natalie Coles, who works with Supercentenarians and she visits them. She has visited previously the oldest woman in the world, Maria Branyas, and she draws their blood. She takes other biomarkers, and she also finds out about their life histories, their family histories. And yes, this is Natalie Coles. She pointed out that it takes a lot of skill to draw their blood because their blood vessels are not like ours. They're very fragile. And if you make a mistake, essentially, there will be blood everywhere. You could do a lot of damage unless you really know what you're doing. So these people still age. They still become frailer. But even at that frail state, all of their systems are functioning at some minimal level so that they last longer than most of the rest of humanity. But of course, they can only last so long. And right now, the upper known limit to human lifespan is 122 years. That was Jean Calment, the oldest yet known woman who died at the age of 122 in 1997. So we want to break that barrier. We want to overcome that. But you can't overcome that if your body just keeps becoming frailer and frailer. And yes, here's Natalie with Aubrey. So Aubrey has been visiting some supercentenarians as well. You need to rejuvenate people if you want them to live past 122. And hopefully, with the treatments that are on the horizon, this will be possible. This hopefully will be possible for Larry Ellison and some others who are in their 80s today.
I mean, it's hard not to, I can't just speculate that, but the range of Trekkies and transhumanists, I would imagine there's kind of a milieu there. There's an intersection. So I can imagine that if anyone was going to save anybody, transhumanists would save their favorite Captain Kirk. Mm-hmm. And I could see that. I could see that maybe there's a group of people that are getting insular treatment. Do you think that that's something that's happening, and what do you think that's going to look like? I mean, you've obviously campaigned against that. You've tried for a long time to stop that, but do you see it happening anyway?
Well, what I think is it's very difficult to keep any kind of secret of this sort for long. And the reason is there's every incentive in favor of this knowledge, if it's genuine knowledge, spreading. First of all, if there were hypothetically a conspiracy to keep these treatments or regimens confined to a few people, there would be defectors. So if you think of this situation, you could think of Bryan Johnson as a defector of sorts, because he clearly doesn't only want billionaires to have access to these treatments. He tells people about his regimen, even if it's more expensive than what most people's resources allow. But he points out people could do 80% of what he's doing on essentially an ordinary budget. So there would be defectors. But the other part of it is there would be incentives for both businesses and governments to make genuinely efficacious treatments available. Businesses, because they want to expand their market share. And if you think about it, what would be a better market? Would it be, say, 5 billionaires who pay you $1 million a piece, which means you would have $5 million in income? Or let's say you have 100 million people to start with, and those 100 million people pay you $1,000 a piece, and all of a sudden you have $100 billion in income, and maybe it won't just be you, it will be a bunch of competitors, because competition is what tends to drive this kind of availability. But take a look at the typical cell phone. This is a much more powerful device than millionaires and billionaires had at their disposal in the year 1990. If you think about all of these bulky cell phones that used to be status symbols, well, now even a subsistence farmer in sub-Saharan Africa has access to a better cell phone. The key is that there be freedom of innovation. Now, governments, if they're rational, which is a big if, by the way, if they're rational, will have certain incentives. So imagine if the costs of Medicare could be greatly reduced, or people don't have to retire as early, because a lot of retirements are actually because people can't work, not because they don't want to work. So if they are not costing the various social safety systems as much money, if they can get cheaper rejuvenation treatments, then governments may want to subsidize those, just as right now, essentially every government in the developed world is subsidizing preventive care, even the United States. So the United States, under the Affordable Care Act, pays for every person to have an annual preventive checkup and a certain basic lab work. And of course, in Europe, even more healthcare is supported in that way. And there is a rationale for prevention being less expensive than having to deal with severe illnesses once they occur. So anti-aging is the best kind of prevention, because if you think about diseases like cancer or diabetes or most forms of heart disease, they strike the elderly at orders of magnitude greater rates than they strike people who are in their 20s or 30s biologically.
You also end up with an educated worker, which might be problematic for some people, but beneficial for others. I think also we've seen examples of this, though. You're right. Like, look at Apple. They got in trouble for it, but they were giving out watches that did this amazing biofeedback and is very great for preventative care. And if you have a bunch of people that you want to keep alive working for you, then this is a very practical thing. Can you conceive of the other side of it, though? People that, you know, are trying to keep this from people. Who's benefiting the most from trying to keep this out of the hands of people?
Mm-hmm. So, of course, there are people who are opposed to this.
And what are their tactics?
There are some people who are opposed to this from an ethical perspective. A lot of bioethicists, people like Leon Kass, who served on the President's Council on Bioethics during the George W. Bush administration, will make arguments like, well, it's virtuous to have a finite life because it focuses people's attention, it gives them a sense of urgency, and so forth. So these are people who have ideological motives. But I think there is a kind of deeper underlying.
He does look like the kind
motive.
of guy who would like, you know, the idea of death, just, you know, generally.
Right. And there were two other bioethicists who actually died fairly recently, Sherwin Newland and Daniel Callahan. And they both wrote that essentially people should not receive treatments to prolong their lives after about the age of 85. So Newland died at the age of 83. Callahan lived a little longer. I think he lived to be 89 or so. And then he died. But they essentially got their wish. They died in their mid to late 80s. But is that really the fate that the rest of us should want for ourselves? It seems that these are people who kind of figured out all the answers for themselves, and they became comfortable with the notion of a finite life. That is essentially the extent to which they could find meaning. as if
So depressing, isn't it?
yeah, as if you could exhaust all the
Oh,
possibilities
that's
of
a
life
bummer.
in 8.5 decades. And they got their wish, but should that be the fate for the rest of us? And furthermore, should we be allowing people with those kinds of limited horizons to control and limit what the rest of us can do? So that's one source from which our enemies could stem. But there's another source, and that is institutional dysfunction or short sightedness, where people might not actually have some grand overarching design to stop this technology. It's just in the short term, using the dynamics of public choice. If you think back to the public choice school of economics, they talked about concentrated benefits and dispersed costs of particular kinds of policies and interventions. Think about US sugar subsidies, which have artificially propped up the sugar industry and made sugar more expensive than it would have been otherwise. And lest one think that making sugar more expensive discourages consumption of harmful sugars, think again, because a lot of food manufacturers, because actual refined sugar was more expensive, resorted to high fructose corn syrup, which is more damaging to one's health.
Yeah, prohibitively unhealthy. Yeah.
Yes. So this policy helped the sugar growers in Florida and other warm
Her
environments in the United
Majesty's
States.
Sugar King. Yeah.
Yes, but it harmed the rest of the US population, not just because it increases the cost of food and everybody else is paying for these sugar subsidies through taxes anyway, but also because it tends to damage the health of the population. People are consuming their sweets in a less healthy form. So that's just one example. And another example could be the mainstream pharmaceutical industry. And again, I don't think they're against life extension. I don't think, contrary to what some may assert, that they're intentionally trying to keep people sick. I think it's more like they want to keep out competition. So they've captured the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, and they've made the process of reviewing and approving new drugs and new medical devices artificially far more expensive than it could have been. So it takes, on average, $2 or $3 billion in 10 to 15 years to get a new drug to market. And what startup can afford to do that? Essentially, any startup that has a promising idea has to try to get bought out by big pharma in
Yeah.
order to have the wherewithal to get its drug through clinical trials. So we need FDA reform. We need it to be possible, at least, to have the ability to market a drug after it has passed safety trials. This is the system that was recently implemented in Japan, so that data on efficacy can be gathered from actual patients. And yes, there could be disclosures, informed consent, so that people know what they're getting themselves into. And furthermore, we need an expanded form of right to try. The Federal Right to Try Act, which was a step in the right direction, unfortunately only applies to terminally ill patients. In 2023, a bill in Montana, the Montana Right to Try Act, was passed, which allowed essentially all willing patients the right to try. And that needs to be scaled up to the rest of the country and ideally the rest of the world. But we also need to make the pharmaceutical companies more comfortable actually offering these experimental drugs. And insurance companies need to be more comfortable covering them, because right now, even in cases where a patient has the legal right to try, a pharmaceutical company could say, well, sorry, we're afraid of the liability potential for this if we let you try this drug. Or the health insurer might say, well, this costs a lot of money. We're not going to cover it. So we need to figure out approaches for these entities to be more comfortable. Again, I don't think they are the enemy as individuals or as organizations per se. I think the incentives are misaligned and the understanding and the long term interest is not there. Short termism is really the biggest problem focusing on the very near-term future at the expense of the longer-term future. If you think of election cycles, how most politicians are in campaign mode all the time, and they think about what issues will get them the most attention and get them elected. And these tend to be the wedge issues. These tend to be the issues that get people riled up, the culture war issues, not issues about the progress of science and technology and the long-term future of our civilization. Or if you think about business incentives for publicly traded corporations, they're focusing on the bottom line, the quarterly earnings report, the stock price. And this doesn't have to be the case, by the way. You can thank or blame Jack Welch of GM for that kind of mentality. But if they were to focus on the longer term, they would realize this technology is really going to be fundamental to how people experience life in the future, and they had better invest in it now so that 20, 30 years from now, their companies are not displaced from whatever market dominance or influence they may be enjoying today. So shifting people's frames of mind, getting them to think longer term, that I think is our major objective. That's what I'm trying to do with the U.S. Transhumanist Party and all the discussions that I engage in.
Absolutely, with the salon. I know also we talked a bit about cryogenics and Greg Fahy, and I think that would be interesting to bring up. You saw him recently, correct?
Yes, that's right. So I attended RadFest in Anaheim, California. He was one of the presenters there. Always very interesting to hear updates from him. He has conducted the TRIM trials, TRIIM, which attempt to rejuvenate middle-aged individuals. And he works in particular on thymus rejuvenation. So the thymus is an endocrine gland that essentially wastes away fairly early on in a person's life. So by the time somebody is 50, they barely have any of it left. So he was able to successfully regenerate his own thymus. And this is what he's offering in the experimental trials as well. So that's one area of his work. And he has a company called Intervene Immune that does that. He has another company called 21st Century Medicine, which focuses on improving cryopreservation techniques. He was really a pioneer in a cryopreservation technique called vitrification, which essentially turns the tissues of the organism into a kind of glass-like substance to prevent the damage that occurs from straight freezing a set of
Ice
tissues.
crystals don't pierce it. It's amazing.
Right. But the key, of course, with vitrification is if you've turned your organs into this glass-like substance, you want to figure out how to reverse that and undo the toxicity of the cryoprotectant. So he has been working on that for a long time. And we know it's possible to bring back C. elegans worms, for instance. So they've been vitrified, and then their vitrification was reversed, and there were experiments done by Daniel Barranco and Natasha Vita-Moore showing that a worm that has been revived from cryopreservation actually preserves its memory, so it can recall objects that it had seen and interacted with before it was cryopreserved. And more recently, Greg Fahy performed experiments with rabbit kidneys, where he and his team vitrified rabbit kidneys. Wow. And then undid that vitrification and reimplanted them back into the rabbits. And there's a rabbit now in the 21st Century Medicine facilities that has been living a normal life for over a year after.
With the glass kidney? This is like, I don't know if this is like Perseus and Medusa. I haven't quite figured out the myth here, but there's something about turning people into stone and back again, which is magical. I'm pretty into this idea. This is pretty interesting stuff.
So you'll be hearing about the rabbit, hopefully sometime soon, sometime within the next year. Wow. But Greg Fahy himself is in his 70s, and he doesn't look like he's in his 70s.
Yeah,
he looks like someone in his 50s.
Yeah, let me pull back up his face again, guys, just so you can see again. Like, so this is what I mean. And I think also when we talked about those guys who died in their 80s, I wonder about how old their parents were, right? Like maybe their parents died of alcoholism or something younger, or had a heart attack. Because I'm so used to, and it sounds like you as well, I have near centennial and supercentennial ancestry. Like a lot of my family, both of my grandparents on both sides lived into their late 90s, and their parents lived, some of them, into like 111, I think, is my great grandfather. And so I'm familiar with people who live very long. It just seems like to die 80 is almost to die young to people that are used to living a long time. I know Japanese people that similarly are familiar with this. And yeah, if your grandfather's alive right now, it would be insane to cut that short, right? I think that's a big part of
Yes,
it. We're living in a different world than some people.
absolutely. And in Japan, if you think about it, the average life expectancy right now is around 84. So that means that a decent percentage of the population, perhaps 50% or more, because there are going to be some extreme early deaths, of course, that
Suicides in
skew that
Japan, yeah.
average down, but 50% or more of the population live beyond that now.
Right.
And if you think about it, that is an amazing achievement of modern civilization. Life expectancy was below 40 everywhere in the world during the year 1800. Think about that. And that was, of course, skewed downward by a lot of infant mortality, by a lot of infectious diseases. This was before the germ theory of disease was widely adopted. This was
Right.
before surgeons washed their hands. This was before public sanitation systems. This was back when people thought that the thing that caused you to get a disease was something called miasma, which was essentially a bad smell emanating from somewhere. And, if you think about it from just an intuitive standpoint, that kind of makes sense. If you
Sure.
avoid things that smell bad, you're less likely to actually catch the pathogens. But what people didn't understand, of course, is these pathogens could be invisible. They could occur at a microscopic scale. Just because you can't smell some large mass of uh, disgusting matter doesn't mean that the pathogens aren't there. So
Right.
that breakthrough was important. And of course, in the 20th century, antibiotics saved a lot of people from bacterial diseases. And there were huge advances in medicine for heart disease, for instance, open heart surgery, as an example. So many people used to die of heart attacks. And if they even had a heart attack and were saved from it, not much could be done to prevent the next heart attack. But right now, if a person, say in their 50s or 60s, has a heart attack and they're able to get to the emergency room in time, chances are they will be able to get the surgeries that they need to survive another few decades. So
Right.
that has been a massive advancement. Cancer rates have increased, but cancer rates have increased largely because people have been living longer, long enough to get cancer.
Really?
Before the 20th century, yes, before the 20th century, cancer rates were lower because most people were dying before the age where they were statistically likely to get cancer.
You don't think, though, that I mean, I feel like it would be hard to say that we don't have environmental factors now that we didn't have in the past, which might be aggravating
I
cancer.
think I think there could be.
I
And
don't have all the data, though. I kind
sure,
of.
sure. And it's a nuanced story. It's not one thing or the other. It's a matter of looking at particular influences.
It's
So for
definitely true that as you get older, I mean, and even just
right.
the idea of what cancer is in terms of tumors that are growing, or that there's a lack of equilibrium in your cellular body. I think that makes sense, and it's also a big concern with the anti-aging rejuvenation techniques, is that we're concerned if cancers could arise from that.
So there have been, for instance, some concerns about certain gene therapies or certain administrations of
Some
stem cells,
hormone
if not
therapies
done
also.
right, hormone therapies, if not done right, leading to cancer. And an example of that was in 1999, there was a teenager named Jesse Gelsinger who got an experimental gene therapy and he got cancer and died. And that essentially resulted in a moratorium being placed on gene therapy research for a few decades, which is tragic. I think more care should have been taken in his case, but also stopping an entire branch of research because of that kind of consequence is quite detrimental in the long run. And
Dude,
it
check the
is an
date.
extreme overreaction. Yes, he died in 1999, September 17th. Oh, well, it
Wow.
looks like tomorrow is the 25-year anniversary of his death. So
Wow.
it's fitting to talk about this.
Timely.
Right, right. And I think it speaks to cognitive biases as well in the human psyche. That's another aspect that transhumanism seeks to overcome. Because I think people tend to be overconfident about something if a bad event has not happened recently. But if a bad event has happened recently, whether it be a terrorist attack, an earthquake, a wildfire, a hurricane, people tend to overreact to that because it's within their salience frame. So they think it is a much bigger threat than it actually is. There were opinion surveys shortly after September 11th, essentially asking people, well, what are you more afraid of? Are you more afraid of dying in an airplane that has been hijacked by terrorists, or are you more afraid of dying in an airplane crash?
Yeah.
And what's
Or type
interesting
2
is,
diabetes would be I'm more afraid of that for sure.
right, right. And that kills more than airplane crashes, a lot more.
Yeah.
But the interesting part of that particular opinion poll, and there have been others like it, is that the former category is subsumed within the latter category. So dying of an airplane crash is by definition more likely than dying of an airplane crash caused by terrorism. It's like saying dying of a gunshot wound is by definition more likely than dying by a gunshot wound caused by your neighbor Joe Smith. But if somebody really doesn't like their neighbor Joe Smith, they might be more afraid of that particular scenario than the generic death by a gunshot wound. And it's all a matter of how one frames the question, really.
Do you have, also Dr. James Wilson, right? He's the guy who did that. He did the what's it called with the boy, what we were just talking about,
Yes.
the experiment, and he's fascinating. I don't know if you looked into him, but there's this thing about the redemption of James Wilson and talking about gene therapy renaissance and how he was just so ahead of the time. They didn't have
Yes.
simulation software, but I mean, gene therapy is just it's so so ubiquitous now to the research. And here's the guy who we said, oh, you were just a little too go trigger happy,
Mm-hmm. And, tragically, it's possible for some people to be completely right, but ahead of their time, or mostly right, but they made some misstep somewhere along the way. And it's really an accident of history that they weren't given greater recognition. But gene therapy has come a long way. So the FDA has been authorizing some
Right.
gene therapies for rare diseases now. And what's more, Liz Parrish, who
Oh, I was
is
just about to
a
pull it
friend
up.
of mine, yes, she in 2015 became the first person to receive a combination gene therapy specifically for the purpose of reversing biological aging. So it was a combination of gene therapies to induce telomerase, which I mentioned. That's the enzyme that allows telomeres to lengthen, and follistatin. So she does not look her chronological age either. She is
What a
actually
gentlemanly way to put
53.
that, by the way. Oh,
Yes,
she's
well,
doing really,
yeah,
really well,
yeah.
She's doing pretty
She
well. She's looking
she
pretty
looks
good. Let's be
she
honest.
looks like someone in her 30s, but she's 53 actually. So
She's beautiful and she's brilliant, and she's doing BioViva, which is the telomere, gene therapy company, right, that she's started. So
that's right.
fascinating, brilliant person, but also she's got, what do you call it? She's got some skin in the game. She's actually doing this with herself. It's not just, yeah, I don't know, interesting stuff. What do you think about the BioViva and the work she's doing generally?
I think it's really important work, and few people have the courage to do it. So she herself, of course, had to go to Columbia to get this experimental combination gene therapy. And really, what BioViva is doing is it is getting patients connected with clinics and providers who would be able to perform these gene therapies for people who are suffering from rare diseases and degenerative conditions for which there's otherwise no real treatment or cure. right
Right.
now.
And you're not
And
allowed to do it anywhere else. It's crazy.
so it's giving these patients the opportunity to extend their lives, and in
And the
so
opportunity
doing,
to is
right,
avoiding pharmaceutical billionaires buying out these products and these research clinics. It's actually kind of like giving these smaller clinics the opportunity to experiment and to progress in this science, which is something that they've been inhibited from doing as well. It's crazy. It's amazing.
yes, absolutely. And actually, Liz Parrish is an advocate for a concept called best choice medicine. She wrote a paper on it together with Dr. Bill Andrews, whom I mentioned. And the idea of best choice medicine is essentially it's even more expansive than right to try. So if a patient thinks that he or she could benefit from a particular experimental treatment, the best choice medicine pathway would be established to enable them to do that. And I think this is a very promising concept and a highly important one to advocate for. Hopefully, we can get the FDA and policymakers to listen, because as in the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s, I think it's possible, if there were enough public support, enough advocacy, sufficiently strong advocacy for it, these policymakers would realize, what do people really have to lose here? If they're dying, if they are suffering from degenerative diseases, why not allow them that option? And why not allow them the option to try to become healthier, to try to extend their lives, and also to make their own decisions? Because patients are smart. They're not going to recklessly gamble with their health, especially if they are the kinds of people who would seek out these treatments. It's likely they're highly health conscious and they carefully consider various treatments already. So, because they want to extend their lives, they're not just going to try something because somebody said it might work. They're going to do their own research.
What about a concern? I mean, we've kind of talked about the insular elite immortal situation, but what about, genetically modified super soldiers from the US, Russia, and China? The idea of a Unter and Übermensch class emergence because of the availability of some of this technology. Do you have any concerns about that?
Well, suppose that there were such super soldiers. Suppose that some country were pursuing that project. Those soldiers have families. They're not exactly at the top of the societal hierarchy right now.
Right.
So, what would the implication be if only they were genetically enhanced? Would the ruling elite of such a country, even if its sole intention is to create more resilient fighting machines, would that ruling elite limit those enhancements to a stratum of people who are not at the top? That would seem to be rather odd. So I think if they're creating super soldiers, that technology is going to spread to other segments of the population. And they wouldn't be just the elite segments. Think about some middle class professional. And let's say this middle class professional right now makes 3 times the salary of a typical soldier. And that middle class professional says, why in the world are they getting the treatments and we're not, even though we can pay for them too? There would be an outcry at that point, and I think the treatments would be made available, at least early on, to the people who can pay, but then the cost will come down through competitive dynamics. So the super soldier scenario doesn't actually worry me. If super soldiers existed, I would say, one, of course, that would be good for the soldiers if they could survive harsh conditions to a greater extent. We want to minimize casualties in war. It would be even better if human fighting individuals were replaced by machines, but not machines that kill people, machines that fought other machines in a kind of ritualized contest to determine which side would prevail. And that way you spare the people, you spare the infrastructure, you spare the resources, and you could even have conditions for resolving the conflict. Like if your country's fighting robots beat the other country's battle robots, then your country gets this piece of territory. So it's a kind of more genteel method of warfare. But the super soldiers, I think, would not be problematic necessarily, as long as they're not engineered to be ruthless, for
Right.
example.
Well, that's another thought. Actually, I love how casually accelerationist you are. You have a minor appreciation for the grace of chaos, and that's good. But there are two genes linked with violent crimes that the BBC has been posting about, right? Talking about the warrior gene and the crime gene, which is such a British way to call a gene, the CDH13 gene. And there's been these videos on the internet, the idea of like isolating genes. Maybe you pull them out of people to make them more docile, or more to your point, maybe you encourage them to exist in a population of super soldier. But what do you think about this also, as we look at transhumanism, the idea that they can literally, if it's not just me making my own decision, they can make decisions about what kind of a person you become and your offspring become?
Well, there is the element of free will, though, and there is the element of
For now.
how one interacts with the rest of one's environment, one's upbringing. We had the free will debate on your channel, and my point is that a person's identity, behavior, personality are not either internally or externally determined by factors outside of their control. Sure, there can be influences, and some people may have genetic influences in a particular direction. Some people may have environmental influences in a particular direction. Even those influences are complex. It's not like you can isolate a single one and say this will definitively bring about certain results. But moreover, people have choices and they're able to make choices to overcome certain kinds of influences. And I think there is no, let's say, recipe for changing the makeup of somebody's personality or the predominant personalities in a given population. I think if it were that easy, it would have been done already. But I would say what's more important is to cultivate institutions and cultural norms and norms of rational discourse that bring out the best in people. And yes, they could be aided by genetic engineering later on.
But
They
it's not
could,
just that, you're right.
right, exactly. So
I
it's
like your
more complex than this.
Michael Rose, his whole thing on diet and aging, kind of to Bryan Johnson's point that 80% of the work is just eating healthy, is just eating the right foods, right? I mean, we look at people who live into their 90s and we see where they come from in the diets they have, and that seems to be part of what helps.
Yes. Well, it's interesting too. Michael Rose is 69 right now. He looks a lot younger than
Yeah.
his chronological age. I saw him at Radfest already. He has definitely taken very good care of himself. But it has also become somewhat of a trope on social media fairly recently that millennials actually look younger than their
Yeah,
chronological
maybe
ages.
microplastics aren't such a bad thing. I don't
Mhm.
know. I don't know.
Well, I have a few ideas about why that might be the case. Number one, sunscreen. So our generation is really the
I
first to take that seriously.
I didn't use a lot of sunscreen, so I don't know. I wonder if I did, how I would be different, because a lot of people I know who use sunscreen. I feel like it does something to this. I don't know. Maybe not. What about glucose levels? I mean, we talk about corn and sugar.
Mhm.
I feel like that's a really big reason why people look young. Is like the rejection of the natural sugars, and these strange synthetic
Right.
sugars are changing the glucose metrics.
Yes, it's possible. So I am not an opponent of artificial sweeteners, by the way. If somebody has a choice of drinking regular Coke with sugar or drinking Diet Coke or Coke Zero, I would say pick the Diet Coke every time because having as much sugar intake as many people get just through soda consumption or sugared beverage consumption definitely cannot be healthy for one. And I'm not the person who rejects all sugar consumption either, but I think having options, having foods with artificial sweeteners or foods with reduced sugar content does help. Of course, for our generation, the sheer variety of food products has increased greatly, and that could help for people who are health conscious. But here's another factor that I think is important: what the early lives of people in the millennial generation were like. Because the millennial generation essentially suffered a bit of a culture shock kind of in their early 20s when the Great Recession happened. And all of a sudden we realized, oh, the world is not at all like we were brought up to believe. But we were brought up to believe that the world was essentially a benign place. At least millennials who mostly grew up in the United States or in the Western world, they were essentially taught, well, if you just study hard, get good grades, work hard, get into a good college, then the path to prosperity and advancement in life is open to you, and it's just up to you, and the system will treat you fairly. Well, that turned out not to be the case, but we really learned that already by the time that we had, at least many of us had, fairly stable and benign early experiences in life. And I
think
think
I
that
offended somebody about aspartame, but I just want to I'm going to back you up here, okay? Like, nobody bully him, because like if you really look into it, you've got 2 amino acids which are broken down rather easily, and phenylalanine is a probably practical thing in a lot of ways. It's just an amino acid. And when you digest aspartame, you get methanol. So up to you what you think about that in terms of your liver, right? There's definitely reasons why you would be careful about hyperconsumption of something that became methanol, but that doesn't, it's such a minor amount because it's such a hyper sweet substance. Granted, you should be careful, but I think his point was, if you're like casually, because I would never almost ever drink a Coke unless it was very, very, very social circumstance. In that circumstance, to avoid sugar and to have an artificial sweetener is probably, in that rare circumstance, probably better than just ingesting so much artificial sugar. Granted, we're talking about Coca-Cola, so it's
right.
probably not good for you either way.
Right. Well, also, it's important to note other aspects of lifestyle are important. So I would say if somebody exercises regularly, whether that be endurance exercise or, say, some form of CrossFit or strength training, that helps a lot. And exercise really was popularized around the 1970s for the general population. It was not the case until fairly recently in our history that most people would try to get some form of exercise other than just as part of their day jobs. If they worked on the farm or in the factories, yes, they would be lifting heavy objects and moving around a lot, but that was not necessarily exercise that was optimal for long-term survival or health, because you could be doing backbreaking labor, for instance. You could be out in the sun for 15 hours a day, and that would age you very quickly without sunscreen, without much sun protection.
I'm going to terrify memory man here too, just because of that. So like methanol, obviously the chemical methanol function breaks down into formaldehyde and formic acid. And I know you're all thinking, okay, formaldehyde preserves bodies, right? Come on. It's too good.
But I think the fact is, living in a civilized infrastructure really helps. The fact that the millennial generation, at least many of us, grew up in suburban or light urban environments with a lot of conveniences of civilization, with air conditioning, with working sanitation systems, with good infrastructure, with the ability to determine how much of our lives we spent indoors versus outdoors. And the 1990s were a fairly benign decade. I think all of that contributed. Now, the other part of this trope is that for whatever reason, Generation Z seems to be aging faster than the millennials. And the explanation for that, I think, is they grew up during harder times. So
yeah, true.
Many people right now who are in their early 20s have no idea what the world was like before September 11th. If you think about it, somebody who was born on September 11th, 2001 is 23 years old right now. So the kind of world that they knew, it was a more insular world, a more fear-ridden world. During most of the time they were aware of the world, the Great Recession would have already happened and kind of wreaked its havoc. The country had become more polarized. People are more
couldn't go to their own
distrustful of one another.
graduation because the entire society collapsed on them. Yeah.
Right. So
Sucks to be them.
this worries me, actually, because the transhumanist movement is in need of younger people. And right now, a lot of the active transhumanists are between the ages of 40 and 70. And these are people who grew up in more techno-optimistic times. These
Yeah.
are people who often remember the golden age of science fiction, the space race, the advances of the information revolution, people who saw huge improvements in films, in computer games. If you think about it, the first Mario Brothers game was released in 1981. So somebody who was 5 at the time who played it would be 48 right now. So these people are well into middle age. And they get the transhumanist ideas, I think, to a certain extent, and maybe quite paradoxically, more so than the younger generation, because the younger generation has been fed this propaganda of despair and polarization and how you must fear what the world is going to be like. And there are these grand problems from which there's no escape, like climate change, and you must hate the other 50% of the country, whatever that is, based on whether you're deemed part of the red tribe or the blue tribe. And that wears on people's psyches. And what I really worry about are intentionally self destructive behaviors on the part of the younger population, because tragically, there is an epidemic of drug use, and drug use to the point that it's causing overdoses. There is an epidemic of suicide. My message is death is wrong. Bryan Johnson's message is don't die. And I would say to the younger listeners here, the number one most effective thing you could do to not die, to radically prolong your lifespans compared to what they would be otherwise, is just don't take any recreational drugs. Don't take any substances that could have an extreme adverse effect on your body. If you think of one type of life decision that could make the difference between, at the very least, say, dying at 30 and living until you're 80, it would be that. And most likely it's not going to be 80. If you live until you're 80, we will be in a dramatically different world, and it would probably be quite easy for you to get to 120 or 150. So this is just really important. This is a point that I feel I need to drive home after so many recent events.
Hold out a little longer, kids. It's worth it. And I think that's also where to go with this conversation, is that things are changing so fast. We started out talking a couple of years ago, I think, about this, and it was kind of quieter, but we could see, hey, there are things happening. Now we see the faces of people that are living this lifestyle. We're seeing the consequences of that existing. So this is today. We have to wonder, if we look at how telescopic evolution of technology is, it's crazy how much further we are with AI. And I don't just mean making pictures, but even that, looking at your pictures, by the way, are great. You're doing amazing stuff with your AI. But
thank you.
The AI data informatics systems for looking at DNA and how it's metabolizing is so much more advanced today than it was 18 months ago. It would be like 10 years of human work that just happened. So, I mean, also we could talk a bit about the work of David Sinclair, and how things are changing with that. What do you think about where we're going? Because if we just stay alive a little bit longer, it looks like we're going to have all the answers.
It's quite fascinating. So a brief note on David Sinclair. In early September, I recorded a Virtual Enlightenment Salon with my friend Dan Elton, who is the director of scholarship of the U.S. Transhumanist Party, and he had the occasion to attend a small-ish gathering with David Sinclair in Massachusetts, where David Sinclair was interviewed by Manolis Kellis, and he has this interesting view on epigenetic aging. Yes, this is the one. And Dan went to the Human Augmentation Summit in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and then he went to this gathering with David Sinclair. There's even a brief video clip that he recorded that he brought back of his interactions with Sinclair. But Sinclair has this view of epigenetic aging as kind of being the rate limiting factor right now. And if we could address the problem of epigenetic aging, we could potentially reach 200 or 300 year lifespans. So obviously there are many theories of aging right now. There are competing theories, and for instance, the damage repair theory that Aubrey de Grey articulates essentially says you have to somehow address all of the 7 principal categories of aging related damage to get that kind of life extension. But David Sinclair seems to think that this epigenetic aging problem is the one that, if it gets solved, that by itself could double or triple the human lifespan. So it's definitely worth looking into. Now, in terms of advances in AI, I will say I am most recently impressed by how the ability to solve mathematical problems has improved. Because when I originally tried out various math problems with ChatGPT in 2022, it made some mistakes, and it made mistakes in a way that was a bit devious, because it could show its work in quotes in a structure and
It
format
looked good,
that,
yeah.
yeah, that would be plausible to somebody who perhaps was not as familiar with the substance of the problems that it was trying to solve,
What
except
a
it
sneaky
would be
student.
wrong.
Yeah.
Yes, it would be like sneakily wrong, and then you'd have to figure out exactly where it made the error. But most recently, I tried asking ChatGPT, which is now powered by GPT 4.0, which is the latest model from OpenAI.
They have the new one, 01, right?
Oh, really?
Yeah, and that one,
Yes.
yeah, keep going though.
But this one was powered by GPT 4.0 based on my understanding. And I actually, back in the late 2000s, published various study guides on my website, The Rational Argumentator, under this section, Free Tools for Rational Education. And I asked it some math problems, like some problems in combinatorics, where, again, the answer isn't just found through rote memorization. For me to write out the solutions to these problems, I needed to do a lot of thinking and stepwise showing of work. And at the time, there were no other solution keys like that online. So I asked ChatGPT to solve these problems and show its work, and it got the correct answer every time that I asked it. So this
So
is a significant advance, I would say.
I'm gonna, because you brought that up, and it's amazing that it's able to do that now. That's kind of the thing, by the way. Like, it used to be a psychopath, but we're like, let it be a liar. Let's see how it goes. They started with Microsoft's working with OpenAI. What is the most popular note-taking software for university students? It's OneNote. OneNote is what people use. So studying that and studying actual students that are writing PhD papers, they created O1. All right. And so O1, how it works, we train these models to spend more time thinking about through problems before they respond, much like a person would. Through training, they learn to refine their thinking process, to try different strategies, and to recognize their mistakes. This is already a huge change from what we've been talking about in terms of AI. In our test, the next model's update performs similar to PhD students on challenging benchmark tasks in physics, chemistry, and biology. We also found that it excels in math and coding. I'm already testing some of this stuff. I did just as a quick thing to see like how good it was making particle. I was like, I want to make like a particle system. And look where I'm at here. Just like you can do, this is like built into a web page now that I wrote with a text I copied from ChatGPT 01. So
Yes.
we're far beyond where we were 6 days ago, let alone a year ago. I mean, it's just crazy where we're at.
Yes. This is astonishing, and perhaps the information that I'm relaying is about 6 days old now. But I've had a lot of fascinating experiences with image generation. So one of my complaints about the early image generators like DALL-E 2 or the early Midjourney was that while they were very good at essentially procedural generation, creating landscapes, for instance, or other so-called natural elements which have various irregularities. So if they have one irregularity here, another irregularity there, you wouldn't really distinguish them from a realistic object. But it does matter with man-made objects like buildings, for instance, or furniture. You would know if your chair didn't have the proper number of legs, or if it had some strange protrusion. You would know if your windows were not symmetrical, for instance, or if your building had architectural details that just don't make sense for whatever reason,
You
or
can
your
intuit it
statue.
naturally to an
Right,
extent. It's amazing how we have that almost mechanical ability to intuit that, but
right,
only to a level that we know, right?
right. But more recently, there have been advances where even these features are able to be rendered to a much greater extent. They're still not always perfect, but sometimes I find it necessary to manually edit and refine some of the AI generated images. And there's a program called Flux AI, which produces immensely realistic architectural details where I find my need to brush them up is greatly reduced. And sometimes I can just use an image as generated and post it to my virtual travel series. Of course, if I ask it to generate landscapes, it does a perfect job, essentially.
Yeah, it's getting pretty impressive. And also you can train it. The Flux thing is amazing because the more you're able to train it, and video now, like the video that it knows, that's really all of it coming together, that it knows the process. And if you can imagine AI able to see how things shift in a video, that's actually very practical to how DNA changes. I think that's what we're going to see very quickly. So again, with kids should be trying to stay healthy for a little longer. This technology is becoming, I mean, we're seeing it every day in real life.
Yes, absolutely. And really, who needs drugs
Yeah.
when one has this kind of technology that is directly accessible? So, whatever kind of world you want to experience, you can
Inst-
experience it directly. You can control the experience. You don't have to chemically alter your brain in dangerous ways.
I said Belarusian chair of the Transhumanist Party becoming immortal on daytime talk show. Instant, instant. AI's doing good things. Well,
Oh,
I
that's
did.
interesting.
I do want to also show like you're not. You put your money where your mouth is. Like here is you banishing death, like legitimately.
Yes.
So you're making sure. I want to make sure I covered also. We talked a bit about Aubrey Gray. I know he has been going through for years now, not just the struggle of trying to extend the life of humanity, but also come under fire and people have attacked him. I mean, is everything working out now, or do you feel like there's an effort to destroy people that are trying to make this happen in the public sphere?
Unfortunately, I do see that there's still a bit of an effort to destroy visionaries like Aubrey de Grey, but really people who try to step outside the mold of essentially trying to conform to expectations of what mainstream institutions will favor. And I really think the reason why Aubrey de Grey experienced so much, let's say, unjustified demonization during the past 3 years, less so now than in August 2021, was because Aubrey put forth this really ambitious vision where he said, well, look at the logical implications of this research. If we can reverse biological aging, even once for people who are in middle age at the time, that would buy them enough time for the next sequence of treatments, and those treatments would buy them time for an even more improved series of treatments, and that could lead to people who live thousands of years. In fact, he said, well, the first 1,000-year-old could be alive today and just 10 years younger than the first 150-year-old.
Right.
Some people didn't like that.
That was
And
where I think you're right. I think that's where they freaked out.
right, right. In fact, one of the people who made the unjustified accusations against him, in particular, for a long time was writing about how she thought these kinds of statements about even 150-year lifespans were unjustified and irresponsible messaging, because her approach was what she specifically called strategic conservatism, which
Yeah.
is to use messaging and rhetoric which would appeal to existing establishment gatekeepers like big pharma or government grant giving bodies, which tend to err on the side of projects that have immediate returns, that are kind of safer, less ambitious, less likely to fail, but also less likely to result in breakthroughs. And she really wanted to succeed in that kind of milieu. She wanted to build up a company very quickly that would get accepted by these establishment gatekeeper institutions. And what she was worried about was that Aubrey was kind of the face of the field, that Aubrey was driving the narrative in a direction that is a lot more ambitious, but maybe these establishment gatekeepers don't understand.
Right. Well, you also have the ideological changes. We talked about the younger generation, but we grew up in a time, I remember very much, an anti-natalist de-escalation of the population agenda and ideology taught to me as a child. Like, we should be careful about having kids, wait till you're able to have kids, have less kids. People are having too many kids. This was something that was very much pushed. And so this idea that we could populate the world with people that wouldn't die. Also, I find it interesting that people that consider themselves scientists are so obsessed with the Book of Death and Buddhism. I don't know what that's about, but it seems like there's a lot of that. There's a lot of these people that think death is this noble thing, which is not, as we've said, very scientific.
Right. No, it's not scientific at all. And I think there really is a fine line, I would say, between, let's say, justified criticism of certain traditions and traditional institutions and ways of thinking, and nihilism on the other hand. So it's important, if you reject something that was the norm in the past, that you don't just replace it with a void or replace it with some self-destructive mentality. And it's interesting too, I don't have any kids, but I'm not an anti-natalist. I think
Right.
people ought to have the freedom to make that choice. But to say that it's bad to have kids, to say that it's bad to have a growing population, I think is misguided. Because as the population grows, from a sheer probabilistic perspective, you will get more exceptional individuals. And let's say, hypothetically, 1 in a million people is brilliant at the level of Newton or Galileo or Einstein or Leonardo da Vinci and capable of transforming civilization. But if they're just alone, if they work on their own, maybe they won't be able to have a lot of influence. They'll just kind of be in their studies and immersed in their little projects like Leonardo was with his notebooks, but they might not actually be able to bring that change about. And Leonardo was brilliant. He just didn't have the infrastructure to implement his ideas. But let's say there are 1 billion people, and now there are 1,000 such people who are each 1 in a million, and they get to interact with one another, and they get to form networks, they get to collaborate, they get to actually influence the way resources are allocated in society. So a population of 1 billion people is going to make not just linearly faster progress than a population of 1 million people. It's going to make exponentially faster progress because of these synergies. So if we add a few more billion people, that's going to add at least a few more thousand exceptionally brilliant people. And others are going to contribute as well. So we shouldn't underestimate the contributions of ordinary individuals, even if they're not able to bring about paradigm shifts. In the proper circumstances, they're able to make things work reasonably well. Really, if you avoid catastrophically bad outcomes, moderately good outcomes will happen essentially as a matter of course. So if you have more people maintaining the various aspects of the infrastructure of our civilization, that would be better. Now, there are different ways of getting more people. One of these ways is through living radically longer, and that is an option that I greatly favor because it preserves the people who are alive now and all of the knowledge and skill sets and experience that they've accumulated.
The others to breed like squid. I saw also when when Aubrey said that, and there was a decent amount of media about him talking about 100-year-olds, 1,000-year-olds. Right afterwards, on Larry King, which I believe had a bigger turnout, they had Neil deGrasse Tyson, talking about not fearing death and why it's so important to die. I know it's just crazy, but my thought is, is there any reason it would be worth it to win the race, to be the first, aside from the fact that you want to be alive when it happens? Is there some reason why they would want to have it and keep it off as long as possible? You've made it clear it's likely to leak into society, but would there be a reason that they're telling kids to just don't worry about it, die, vape,
So it's interesting because for a long time, the 4-minute barrier for running the fastest mile was not broken by anybody. But when Roger Bannister did it, all of a sudden, right after him, a whole succession of people started to run sub 4-minute miles. So whenever somebody becomes the first, whenever somebody becomes a pioneer in terms of a major breakthrough, almost always others will not be far behind. And I think it's because the accumulation of knowledge and ideas and aspirations in that direction will have just been so immense that the achievement couldn't just be limited to a single individual. Because think about, even if somebody lives to, say, 125 years, that's going to raise enough attention that people are going to ask, well, how did this person do that? Well, why is this person different? What changed? And whatever changed, it wouldn't have just changed with that one person in 8 billion now. There would have been other people who would have had similar beneficial changes, whether that be due to lifestyle, or maybe they were in a more fortunate cohort that hypothetically would have grown up in a more peaceful time. So, say people who were born in the 1920s, for instance, yes, they had World War II when they were in their 20s, but up until World War II, let's say hypothetically, they were growing up in more peaceful times than people who were born in the 1900s and lived through World War I as kids. So maybe some of those are going to live longer. Maybe they had the benefit of more modern technologies when they were in their prime. So if the first 125-year-old is among them, the second 125-year-old is likely to not be that far behind. So I don't think it's going to be the case that one person is ever going to be able to get that kind of age. And likewise, I think for other aspects of human endeavor, progress in AI, it's not going to be that one company will leapfrog so far ahead of the rest that it will just leave them in the dust. If one company doesn't make these advances, there are a few others that are not far behind that will. Or with space exploration, yes, SpaceX is doing some remarkable projects right now, but let's say SpaceX doesn't make it to another world. Maybe Jeff Bezos's Blue Origin would make it, or the Chinese companies or the Chinese government will make it there, or the Russian space industry might get revitalized. So I think once all of the factors are there and they combine to bring about the progress, it's a question of whether we as a society accept it. Now, it could be that in a sufficiently early time period, that progress could get suffocated. And that's what I was worried about when Aubrey was suffering these unjustified aspersions cast in his direction, because I thought this was still early enough. The rejuvenation treatments aren't here yet.
Or even just the subliminal messaging to tell kids that you shouldn't fear life, don't fear death. Fear the ozone layer, fear taxes, fear work, fear your dreams, fear your nightmares, but don't fear death. That's the one thing you can rely on. That is your God. That is what kids were told. It just seems to me like that seems very aimed and targeted.
Yes, absolutely. And it's interesting how the cultural messaging has changed, even though we live in overall more prosperous times than many prior generations. There could be some unfavorable comparisons made, say, to our parents' generation, though not always. So my parents, of course, grew up in the Soviet Union, and I'm definitely more prosperous than they were at my age. But for people whose families also grew up in the United States, you could say, okay, young people today may not have some of the same opportunities, especially when it comes to purchasing housing or other larger scale goods. However, what is odd is in prior generations, say in the late 19th century or early 20th century, when so many immigrants came to the United States with virtually nothing, and they built entire prosperous lives from scratch at a lower level of technology because they had the work ethic, they had the confidence in a better future. Right now, the cultural messaging is trying to inculcate that confidence out of young people and indeed tell them, engage in whatever dissipative activity you feel like. And all that matters is how you construe your own identity, whatever that may be. And it doesn't matter what the real world consequences of that are. And I think that too is a misleading kind of ideology because it detaches a person from the real physical world on which human lives succeed or fail. So I think it's important in certain respects to return to attitudes of self-reliance, of life being meliorable, subject to improvement, and the willingness to work really hard to get there. Because if you're able to work really hard to get there, you can overcome some of these obstacles, even deleterious societal trends as well. But the key is to have that sense of purpose and the sense that life can be better. And it is up to you to a great extent.
I know it's been kind of a fairy tale to kind of watch Ray Kurzweil like follow this path, and then we talked about how you've interviewed him in his former book, Singularity is Near, but you also mentioned Singularity is Nearer. I don't know how much you've read that. Have you checked that out yet?
I have not had the opportunity yet, but I definitely
Same.
will in the not too distant future, and I'd be happy to talk to you about that. My general observation about Ray Kurzweil's predictions is that from the standpoint of technological feasibility, he has largely been correct in terms of when certain technologies were possible. I mentioned previously on your show that driverless cars existed in 2009 when Ray Kurzweil predicted that they would exist. But
Right.
technological capabilities do not imply societal adoption. So,
Yeah, sure.
in addition to the technologies existing, they have to be mass produced, they have to be marketed, people have to accept them. The legal framework has to be there to enable their acceptance, to prevent quirks like how to determine liability from impeding mass adoption. So that hasn't happened yet in terms of autonomous vehicles. Now, there are certainly advances. There are certain cities where level 4 autonomous vehicles can operate, and there's a
Oh yeah.
system of 5 levels. Level 5 autonomous vehicles could potentially drive anywhere all on their own without human intervention,
I mean,
and those don't exist yet. But level
Tesla's
4,
self-driving cars have kind of gotten it finally. Like it took a while, but like they've got a pretty good setup going now.
right. I would say Tesla is still level 2 or 3, though, because quite emphatically, and Tesla's own guidance will communicate this, you need a human driver behind the wheel paying attention,
Yeah.
being ready to intercede in any situation. But there are autonomous taxis, like Waymo has fleets of autonomous taxis that are level 4 autonomous, which means they can completely operate on their own within a predefined domain. So that could mean, for instance, the streets of San Francisco. Let's say Waymo has the streets of San Francisco mapped out really well, and the cars know every corner, every little obstacle. They have a huge database, and they can detect minute changes, deviations from that. But if you take them from San Francisco and you transplant them into some other urban environment, they would not be as well suited to that. They might still do a pretty decent job, but they'll miss some of these edge cases. So for true level 5 autonomy, a lot more work still needs to be done. But it is a lot further along than it was in 2009. And it's further along in terms of societal adoption. The fact that you can order an autonomous taxi right now is a lot of progress. Though I think the true revolution will be when we can purchase truly autonomous vehicles, when you could own a level 5 self-driving car. That would be amazing, and it
Well,
would save so many lives.
I mean, can you just The own nothing and be happy thing seems like the one they're going for. Really quickly, Dyson sphere technically possible but not likely. You know he's talking about Dyson spheres. By the way, have you ever seen a theoretical map of the amount of satellites around the world moving along?
Yeah, that's
Uh,
astonishing.
yeah, this idea of the singularity is interesting to me. So, how do you think the singularity relates to transhumanism in that sense?
So I think we've already had three technological singularities: the agricultural revolution, the industrial, and the information revolution. And really, a technological singularity is an event horizon beyond which, for somebody from a prior era, it's essentially impossible to foresee exactly how events will turn out. As we approach that event horizon, we will be able to discern a bit more. So, for example, as AI technologies advance, we will have the conceptual machinery to even be able to talk about what they do, for instance. Think about what the conversation would have been like about image generating or music generating AIs even 20 years ago. And even in 2019, I was thinking of algorithmically generated music, and that had existed as a kind of niche pursuit for a while. But I wrote a paper about musical creativity through algorithms and AI in 2019. And back then, that was still an extremely novel idea. Few people really understood what I was talking about. And right now, essentially, millions of fairly ordinary people, not necessarily,
Casual adopters, yeah.
yes, yes, not necessarily tech savvy people at all, can go to a website like Suno and create a song, all for themselves based on their own lyrics, their own stylistic inputs. And it has brought about a genuine renaissance of creativity. But now people in the entire society have the vocabulary to describe what these systems do and an idea of what they could be used for. And once they have those concepts, they can take them to the next level. And some people who are more forward thinking might think about, well, how can these ideas be combined? How can these functionalities be extended to create even more functionalities to enable us to do something even greater, even more ambitious than what is able to be done right now? So Ray Kurzweil still posits 2045 as the date for the singularity as he conceives of it, which is essentially artificial superintelligence,
Right.
when AIs become so much more intelligent than humans that essentially they can create a new world that is different from anything that we're capable of conceiving of, except it's not a dystopian scenario because we will have essentially merged with these AIs, according to Ray Kurzweil. So their capabilities and our capabilities would become integrated, and our future selves would be able to anticipate the next steps in that transition. So while it may seem like an event horizon to us right now, to us in the year 2044, maybe that will seem like, oh, just the next few steps that follow from the reality as it will be at that time.
Man, it's crazy. We're like maybe 25 years almost from the post singularity expectation of Kurzweil. How excited are you, and what are you thinking about in terms of the 2050 yourself in 2050?
Well, my hope is that myself in 2050 will be younger, smarter, more capable, more accomplished, and have a much longer life expectancy
So
from
just
that
Jack
point
Benny. You just
forward.
want to be Jack Benny. You want to be 29 forever. All right, that's fair.
Yeah, I don't have any ambition of like becoming a digital entity or anything like that.
Yeah.
I just want to be myself, but more durable without the limitations that I currently have. And I think those future technologies would enable it. But from an aesthetic standpoint, it's quite possible that humans then will resemble humans now. To some extent, there will be stylistic modifications, there will be a lot more diversity. So, transhumanists do advocate for a concept called morphological freedom, which means people will be able to determine to a great extent what they look like. But some people, and that would include myself, will opt for a more traditional aesthetic, and I think that world
When
will
you look this
accommodate that as
good,
well.
what are you gonna just keep it the way it is. Tell me how to plug the Transhumanist Party, because this is one of my favorite things. And also, where can I buy a shirt? Do you have a shop on here? I've been meaning
Oh,
to
yes,
get
we
one.
do. If you scroll to the bottom of this page, we have a Zazzle shop on the homepage. Just scroll up a little bit from that when you start seeing content. Yes, there it is.
Zazzle.
So
All right, I'm
click
gonna
on
go there.
Zazzle here. And the Transhumanist Party is almost 10 years old now. It will turn 10 on October 7th, 2024. And as you can see, we have a lot of merchandise here: shirts, mugs, bumper stickers. We have a presidential candidate, Tom Ross, and a vice presidential candidate, Daniel Tweed. You can
You have
see,
a tweet on this shirt. That's based. I like tweet.
yes, Daniel Tweed is here. And you can also see how AI art generation has advanced with these images.
Yeah,
But we
true.
have so many styles to choose from. The Transhumanist Party advocates for putting science, health, and technology at the forefront of American politics. We want to actually achieve the kind of future that we were discussing, but we recognize that it's not guaranteed. It's not a foregone conclusion when futurists talk about these scenarios like a forthcoming technological singularity. We need to do some work to make it happen. We can't just sit back. And this is my paper, The United States Transhumanist Party and the Politics of Abundance. It discusses the state of the USTP and the transhumanist movement through essentially the end of 2018, but it's still a good start if you want to learn about what we stand for and how we are trying to inaugurate a new paradigm for a politics of abundance, where we don't focus so much on zero-sum culture wars. We focus on the changes that will benefit everybody and empower all human beings, no matter what your background, your gender, your skin color, your religion. We have members from all over the world, actually, and we're a big tent. We welcome anybody who wants to participate in this collaboration to create a better future. And I would just encourage you, if you're interested in any of the ideas that were discussed on the show, you can go to the free membership page on our website, sign up. It takes less than a minute. As the title suggests, it's free. You just fill out a simple application, and then you'll join our mailing list. You'll be able to participate in our platform votes and votes for endorsing future candidates, and generally get involved. We have a lot of projects for which we need volunteers. We need to build up our website. We need to build up informational resources about transhumanism. And we need more people to engage in advocacy at state levels. We need more people to monitor legislation, for instance, that may be relevant to various emerging technologies. We also advocate electoral reforms like ranked choice voting or proportional representation that could help break this logjam that the two-party system has placed the United States in.
That's awesome. And I think you guys give advice to voters too, right? In circumstances of what is going on.
Yes. And what we hope to do for this election is to provide some guides about ballot propositions in certain states. We certainly want to do those guides for Nevada and California, but other states too will have ballot questions where people can vote directly on the issues. And that's actually a more reliable way to affect policy than voting for a particular candidate. If you vote for a human, that human might do something different than what you intended. But if you vote for a policy or against a policy, you know pretty much what outcome you would like to get, and your vote can definitely help to move the needle toward that outcome. So we try to inform people. We are a policy-oriented political party. So we're not seeking to score points against any other group
Right.
of people or any other party. We actually want to see some meaningful changes happen.
And you often have to work through that. And if you're in a state that's run by the blue or the red, going through something that's kind of independent, you can work through both, and you can actually tell your local constituency or politicians about policies that are being voted on or could be voted on that are mentioned by the Transhumanist Party. So I think it's something that's really useful, even though it's not the monolithic elite New World Order party. That might be the thing to do. Don't just be independent. Stand for something. You know what I mean?
Yes, yes, absolutely. So I think one of the vulnerabilities of a lot of the independent or minor political parties is that it hasn't been exactly clear what they've stood for. For instance, the Forward Party, I think, started out with very noble motivations, and I certainly appreciate what Andrew Yang has been trying to do in terms of actually talking about technology and its implications and also advocating for electoral reform. So I think the Forward Party is very well intentioned and could be aligned with us, but it has become a bit diluted. So some of the more ambitious points of Andrew Yang's campaign, like a universal basic income, have not really been emphasized by the Forward Party. And indeed, the Forward Party essentially threw out its platform altogether. And so they're doing some good activism on the ground, but if it's not clear what an organization stands for, people kind of lose track of it and it's not as memorable. Or if you have an organization like the Libertarian Party, which is really being torn apart by schisms to the point where at the Libertarian National Convention, 40% of the delegates decided to vote for none of the above, which was essentially a call for the Libertarian Party to not endorse any candidate. Yes, yes, and essentially capitulate to Trump because Trump decided to grace them with his presence. And fortunately, the other 60% decided to still nominate a candidate, Chase Oliver, and I think he's pretty good. But I think the Libertarian Party can no longer really claim to be the party of principle. It's the party of whichever faction takes over the party machinery at the time and causes enough rancor in the meantime. So we need
There's also
a true
an
party
interesting
of principle.
connection between Larry Ellison and Trump, but I'll leave that aside. I don't know. I mean, hey, he's doing well. He seems kind of witty, so it must be a good thing. I also want everyone to subscribe to your YouTube channel. You did an amazing video, the salon you did with Dan, about the Carrington event and the radio and the invention of amateur radio and how that was ethereally uplifting for humanity. I think these are really great. So I hope all of you are checking out the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salons, because he does these rather regularly and they're fantastic.
Yes, we do them every Sunday at 1 p.m. Pacific time, 4 p.m. Eastern time. We have done them every Sunday since May of 2020. So this was a great innovation that stemmed out of necessity to a certain extent, because during the early pandemic, people were locked down, people were isolated from one another, but we still needed a way to communicate. We still needed a way to exchange ideas and advance our civilization. And sometimes we have musical performances for our salons. Sometimes we have discussions of AI, like this one with Peter Voss, who was one of the three people who actually coined the term artificial general intelligence. And he is working on AGI right now. He thinks the current large language models are not the path to AGI, but his approach may be a lot more promising than that. So we try to bring in actual innovators, people who are on the cutting edge.
You have some people with some clout. Like, these are some pretty legitimate futurists. They're the people that are making the most progress. It's really impressive, man. I appreciate it. CW says, great stream and info. Hit that like and subscribe button, everyone. I tend to agree. I hope you all do too. Gennady, I hope to see you again very soon. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Andreas. Likewise, it was great speaking with you again, and I hope that we can all live long and prosper.
Shakina, bro. Good to see you.